reptilian elite, shapeshifters in positions of power. There's a theory so vast in its implications that accepting even a fragment of it forces you to reconsider everything you think you know about human history, power structures, and the nature of those who govern us. It suggests that the world's most influential positions, political leadership, financial control, media dominance, religious authority, are occupied not by humans, but by something else wearing human form. Reptilian entities, beings from a species that predates humanity or comes from elsewhere entirely, who can shapeshift between their true appearance and human disguise, who have infiltrated the highest levels of every society on Earth, who manipulate global events toward outcomes that serve their agenda rather than human interests. It sounds like science fiction until you start examining the evidence that believers compile. The testimonies from those who claim to have seen the mask slip, the patterns in bloodlines and power structures that suggest something beyond normal human ambition is guiding civilization toward purposes we're not meant to understand. The modern articulation of this theory owes much to David Icke, the British author and speaker, who spent decades detailing his claims about reptilian control of human society. According to Icke and others who've expanded on his work, these beings aren't recent arrivals, but have been present throughout human history, referenced in ancient texts and mythologies as dragons, serpents, gods who came from the sky and established dominion over primitive humans. The Anunnaki of Sumerian texts, the serpent in Eden, the dragon kings of Asian mythology, the feathered serpents of Mesoamerican cultures, all allegedly describing the same species, reptilian intelligences who've been interacting with and controlling humanity for thousands of years, who see us as a resource to be managed, a species to be harvested for energy, labor, or purposes we can't fully comprehend from our limited perspective. The shapeshifting ability is central to how they maintain control without being recognized. In their natural form, they're described as tall, powerfully built beings with reptilian features, scaled skin, vertical slit pupils, predatory faces that blend human and lizard characteristics in ways that trigger instinctive revulsion in anyone who sees them. But they can alter their appearance, projecting human form through technology or psychic manipulation or biological capability, appearing completely human to normal perception while maintaining their true nature beneath the disguise. This allows them to move through human society undetected, to occupy positions of power and influence without triggering the defensive response that their true appearance would provoke. The disguise isn't perfect, according to those who believe they've witnessed it. Under certain conditions, extreme emotion, stress, during specific rituals, or in the presence of particular technologies, the reptilian nature becomes briefly visible. Witnesses describe seeing the eyes change, pupils shifting from round to vertical slits, the iris taking on an unnatural color or reflective quality. The skin seems to shimmer or scale over, as if the surface is trying to maintain human texture, but briefly reveals what's underneath. The face might elongate slightly, bone structure shifting in ways that human skulls can't accommodate. These glimpses last only moments before the disguise reasserts itself, but they're enough to convince witnesses that they've seen something that shouldn't exist, that the human they're looking at is a facade concealing something else entirely. The theory holds that reptilian bloodlines have interbred with humans over millennia, creating hybrid individuals who carry reptilian genetics but appear completely human. These hybrids are supposedly more susceptible to reptilian control, more likely to advance into positions of power, because they're being supported and guided by the full-blooded reptilians who recognize them as vessels for their agenda. Royal families, political dynasties, banking families who've held wealth and influence for generations. Believers point to these bloodlines as evidence of reptilian genetics being preserved and propagated, ensuring that control remains concentrated in specific lineages that can be trusted to serve reptilian rather than human interests. The bloodline emphasis explains, according to this theory, why power tends to stay within certain families, why political and financial elites intermarry and form networks that exclude outsiders, why wealth and control concentrate rather than distribute. It's not just human tribalism or greed, it's genetic selection, reptilian overlords, ensuring that positions of influence go to individuals who carry their DNA and can therefore be controlled more effectively, or who naturally align with reptilian goals because of their hybrid nature. Every major political figure, every central banker, every media mogul, every individual with capacity to shape public opinion or direct policy. Believers scrutinize their genealogies looking for connections to known bloodlines, for evidence that they're part of the network rather than outsiders who genuinely rose on merit. The control mechanisms extend beyond genetics into ritual and symbolism. Secret societies, occult practices, ceremonies that appear to outsiders as nothing more than tradition or pageantry, but that supposedly serve actual functions relating to reptilian power structures. These rituals might involve energy harvesting, consciousness manipulation, communication with reptilian entities, or maintaining the control grid that keeps humanity docile and manageable. Believers point to the prevalence of serpent and dragon imagery in royal heraldry, corporate logos, religious symbolism, government seals. Evidence, they claim, that reptilian presence is hidden in plain sight, their symbols marking territory and signaling allegiance to those who know how to read them. The question of what reptilians want from humanity, why they've invested such effort in infiltration and control, produces answers that range from the mundane to the horrifying. Some theories suggest they feed on human energy, particularly fear and suffering, that negative emotions produce vibrations or consciousness states that reptilians harvest for sustenance or pleasure. This would explain why human history is so saturated with war, oppression, and engineered catastrophe. It's not accidental or the result of human nature, but deliberately cultivated, conflicts and suffering generated by those in power because their reptilian masters benefit from the energy that trauma and fear produce. Others propose that humanity is a genetic resource, that reptilians are conducting long-term breeding programs to create optimal hybrid forms, that abduction phenomena and reproductive manipulation serve the goal of blending reptilian and human genetics in precise ways that produce individuals with specific capabilities. The hybrids might be vehicles for reptilian consciousness, bodies that can house their awareness while functioning in human society. Or they might be a replacement species, gradually bred to have more reptilian traits while maintaining enough human appearance to avoid detection, eventually replacing baseline humanity entirely with a population more suited to reptilian control. There are also theories about Earth itself being the prize, that reptilians are an ancient species who either originated here before humans or who arrived long ago and consider the planet their territory, with humanity viewed as squatters or invasive species that must be managed and eventually reduced or eliminated. In this framework, environmental destruction, population control agendas, wars that devastate human populations, all serve the goal of reducing humanity's numbers and impact, while reptilian hybrids increase their proportion of the global population. A slow genocide that will eventually leave Earth controlled by beings that carry reptilian genetics and serve reptilian interests. The evidence believers compile includes witness testimony from people who claim to have seen shapeshifting, or who say they were raised in families controlled by reptilians. These accounts describe childhoods in elite circles, where they witnessed things that contradicted surface appearances, where they saw authority figures who were publicly human reveal reptilian characteristics in private, where they were subjected to abuse or training designed to fragment their psyche and make them susceptible to programming. Many of these testimonies come from individuals with histories of trauma or mental health challenges, which skeptics use to dismiss their claims, but which believers argue is precisely what you'd expect. Reptilian control involves trauma-based mind control, and victims who try to speak out are deliberately destabilized and discredited. There's also video analysis, footage of public figures where believers claim to see evidence of shape-shifting, pupils that briefly appear wrong, skin textures that seem to glitch, facial proportions that shift in ways video compression artifacts don't explain. Skeptics point out that these observations depend heavily on video quality, lighting conditions, and the tendency to see patterns where none exist, that any high-definition footage examined frame by frame will show momentary anomalies that mean nothing. But believers counter that dismissing all evidence as artifact or misinterpretation ignores the consistency of what witnesses report. The fact that descriptions of reptilian features remain similar across different people, different locations, different decades. The theory also attempts to explain why disclosure hasn't occurred, why reptilians haven't been definitively exposed if they're really controlling human society. The answer is that they control the disclosure mechanisms: media, government, scientific institutions. All the systems that would be responsible for revealing and investigating such presence are operated by individuals loyal to or controlled by reptilians themselves. Any evidence that surfaces gets suppressed or ridiculed. Any witness who comes forward gets discredited or silenced. Any investigation that gets too close to truth gets redirected or terminated. The absence of mainstream acknowledgement isn't evidence that reptilians don't exist, but proof that the control system is functioning exactly as designed, keeping the truth contained within conspiracy theory forums and fringe communities where it can be safely ignored by the majority. Some versions of the theory incorporate extraterrestrial origins, suggesting reptilians came to Earth from elsewhere. Possibly the Alpha Draconis star system, which is where the term Draconians comes from, another name used for these entities. They arrived thousands or millions of years ago, established bases underground or in remote locations, and began the long process of infiltrating and controlling surface civilizations. Other versions propose they're interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial, existing in frequency ranges or dimensional layers that overlap with our reality, but aren't normally visible, able to manifest physically when needed, but primarily operating from spaces human perception can't access. The underground base theory connects reptilian presence to broader conspiracy frameworks about deep underground military bases and tunnel systems, suggesting that beneath major cities and government facilities are reptilian habitats and control centers where the actual governance occurs, where decisions affecting surface humanity are made by beings who never experience daylight or interact directly with the populations they control. Human leaders travel to these facilities for instructions or briefings, returning to make policy that appears to come from human deliberation, but is actually implementing directives from their reptilian handlers. Critics of the reptilian theory point to its origins in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that portrayed Jewish people as secretly controlling world events, noting that reptilian theory often maps onto these same structures, substituting reptilians for Jews, but maintaining the framework of hidden ethnic or species-based control. This is a serious and valid criticism. Conspiracy theories about secret groups controlling the world have historically been used to justify persecution and violence. However, believers argue that legitimate reptilian presence is separate from anti-Semitic scapegoating, that acknowledging non-human infiltration of power structures isn't the same as claiming any human ethnic or religious group is collectively responsible for malicious control. The psychological appeal of reptilian theory is worth examining regardless of its factual validity. It provides a framework where human evil, the wars, the exploitation, the apparent sadism with which elites treat ordinary people, isn't really human at all, but the work of another species. This is oddly comforting because it suggests that humans aren't fundamentally corrupt, that the cruelty we observe in positions of power doesn't reflect human nature, but reptilian nature expressing itself through hybrid vessels. It also creates clear good and evil categories, true humans versus reptilian infiltrators, with the struggle reframed as species conflict rather than political or ideological disagreement. But there's something deeply troubling about this framework as well. If you believe powerful people aren't human, if you've dehumanized them literally by deciding they're another species, what actions become justifiable? The reptilian theory, taken to its extreme, suggests that removing these beings from power isn't political change, but species defense, that any action against them is acceptable because they're not really human and therefore don't deserve human rights or ethical consideration. This is where conspiracy theory becomes potentially dangerous, when it provides justification for violence by reframing opponents as something other than human. Whether reptilian entities actually exist, whether they've infiltrated human power structures, or whether this theory represents psychological projection and pattern seeking, applied to the observation that elites often seem to lack empathy and serve interests that appear hostile to ordinary humanity. The idea persists because it resonates. People look at those in power and observe behavior that seems incomprehensibly callous, decisions that appear designed to cause suffering, responses to crisis that suggest those making them don't value human life. The question, how can they be so cruel, finds an answer in because they're not really human, which is more comforting than because humans in power systems become corrupt and disconnected, or because the incentive structures of global capitalism reward psychopathic behavior. The reptilian elite theory asks us to believe that reality is far stranger than surface appearance suggests, that the people we see making decisions that affect our lives are masks worn by something else, that the world is controlled by intelligences whose nature and agenda remain hidden behind a sophisticated deception that's been maintained for millennia. It suggests that human history isn't really human at all, but has been guided and manipulated by external intelligence, using us for purposes we can't access from our limited perspective. Whether this represents truth that's been hidden, or compelling mythology that explains the inexplicable cruelty sometimes observed in those with power, it remains one of the most persistent and disturbing frameworks in conspiracy theory culture, a narrative that transforms every interaction with authority into potential contact with something that wears humanity like a disguise, but doesn't share human interests, human values, or human limitations. And somewhere in the centers of power, in offices and boardrooms, where decisions affecting billions are made, either humans sit making human choices for human reasons, or something else sits behind human eyes, maintaining the disguise, advancing an agenda, waiting for the moment when humanity finally notices what's been hidden among us all along, what's been ruling from the shadows in plain sight, what looks at us not as individuals deserving dignity, but as resources to be managed by intelligence that wears our form but will never share our nature. Number stations, mysterious radio, broadcasts that never stop. Imagine sitting alone in a dark room at 3 a.m, slowly turning the dial on a shortwave radio. Through the static and interference between the fading signals of distant music stations and the crackle of atmospheric noise, you suddenly hear a voice. It's a woman speaking Spanish, but something about her tone isn't quite right. She's not conversing, not announcing, not communicating in any normal sense. She's simply reading numbers. Atención, atención. 3, 7, 2, 9, 4, 8. The voice continues, emotionless and precise, reading 5-digit groups with mechanical rhythm. You listen for a minute, 5 minutes, 10, and the numbers never stop, never explain themselves, never acknowledge that anyone is listening. Then, as abruptly as it began, the transmission ends. Silence. You're left in the darkness, wondering what you just heard, who was meant to hear it, and what those numbers might have instructed someone, somewhere, to do. This isn't fiction. This is happening right now, on frequencies you can access, with equipment you can buy online. Across the shortwave radio spectrum, voices speak into the void continuously, reading numbers that sound random but carry meaning someone desperately needs to know. They've been doing this for decades, probably longer than anyone publicly admits. No government claims them. No official source acknowledges their purpose. Yet they persist, night after night, broadcasting instructions we can hear, but never understand. Coordinating operations we'll never know about. Moving pieces on a chessboard we can't see. The Cold War made these stations infamous, though they existed before and continue long after. Intelligence agencies needed a way to communicate with agents operating in hostile territory. People who couldn't risk meeting handlers, couldn't use telephones or telegrams that could be monitored, couldn't do anything that would reveal they were receiving instructions from a foreign power. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity and absolutely unbreakable in its security. Broadcast encrypted messages using one-time pad encryption over shortwave radio. The agent needs only a radio and a pad of random numbers. When the transmission comes, they write down the broadcast numbers, apply the corresponding section of their pad, and the message reveals itself. Then they burn that page of the pad. Without that specific pad, the message is mathematically impossible to decrypt, even with unlimited computing power and infinite time. The enemy can record every transmission, can listen to every broadcast, can capture every signal, and still learn nothing. What makes this system so unsettling is its openness. These aren't hidden communications on classified frequencies. Anyone can listen. Shortwave enthusiasts stumbled onto number stations decades ago and have been documenting them ever since, creating catalogs of stations identified by their characteristics because no one officially names them. The Lincolnshire Poacher began each transmission with bars from an English folk song before a woman's voice read number groups. The station broadcast for over 30 years, believed to be operated by British intelligence from Cyprus, aimed at agents in the Middle East and beyond. Then, in 2008, it simply stopped. No announcement, no explanation. The agents who had spent years listening for that specific musical phrase at specific times would have tuned in one day to find only silence. What does that silence mean? Were the operations complete? Were the agents extracted? Or was something darker implied by that sudden termination? The buzzer is still active, broadcasting from Russia on the same frequency it's occupied for decades. Most of the time, it produces exactly what its name suggests: a harsh, monotonous buzzing tone that repeats approximately 25 times per minute, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. Occasionally, the buzzing stops, and a Russian voice reads call signs, numbers, or brief phrases before the buzzing resumes. Sometimes months pass between voice transmissions. What purpose does that constant buzzing serve? Is it claiming the frequency, ensuring no one else uses it? Is it a heartbeat signal, proof the system is operational and monitoring? Or is the buzzing itself encoded information, variations in tone or timing, carrying messages that sophisticated receivers can extract, while casual listeners hear only monotonous repetition? Then there are the children. Some stations use voices that sound impossibly young, speaking with the clarity and innocence of childhood, while reading number sequences that might be ordering surveillance, dead drops, or worse. The Swedish Rhapsody opened with an eerie music box melody. Then a young girl's voice counted in German. 1, 2, 3, 4. The juxtaposition of childlike voice with the cold reality of espionage creates profound unease. Why children's voices? Perhaps they're distinctive, impossible to confuse with normal radio traffic. Perhaps early speech synthesis systems produced these tones more easily. Or perhaps there's something deliberately disturbing about it, something designed to ensure the recipient pays attention, recognizes their specific station among the dozens of broadcasts crossing the shortwave bands on any given night. In 1998, the veil lifted briefly during a U.S. federal prosecution of Cuban intelligence officers operating in Florida. Among the evidence presented in court were recordings of number stations, one-time pads found in the defendant's possession, and decrypted messages proving that broadcast numbers, when processed with the correct pad, yielded intelligence instructions. The Cuban agents had been listening to stations broadcasting from their homeland, receiving orders about what to observe, what to report, who to monitor. The trial provided rare official confirmation of what everyone already knew, but rarely acknowledged. These broadcasts aren't mysteries or anomalies. They're active intelligence operations, communications between handlers and assets, ongoing coordination of espionage conducted completely in the open, yet absolutely secure. But that case revealed only what one cell was doing, one network's operations. How many other agents listen to how many other stations? How many broadcasts per night carry instructions we'll never know about? The shortwave spectrum is vast, and number stations occupy only tiny slivers of it. Yet enthusiasts have documented hundreds of distinct stations over the decades, broadcasting in Russian, Spanish, English, German, Czech, Korean, Mandarin. Every major intelligence service and many minor ones apparently use this method. Right now, as you read this, someone somewhere is tuning their radio to a predetermined frequency, waiting for the signal that tells them their message is coming, preparing to write down numbers that will tell them what to do next. The broadcasts follow patterns that speak to careful planning and operational security. Many maintain rigid schedules, same frequency, same time, same day of the week. Others appear to be event-driven, activating only when there's a message to transmit. Some broadcast brief transmissions lasting minutes. Others run for hours, reading thousands of number groups as if the message is enormous, or as if multiple recipients are pulling different sections from the same broadcast. The formats vary in ways that probably mean something to insiders. 4-figure groups versus 5-figure groups. Letters instead of numbers, phonetic alphabets, binary tones that might be automated encryption rather than human-readable content. Each variation suggests different purposes, different operational requirements, different levels in whatever hierarchy coordinates these shadow communications. What haunts the listener is the certainty that these numbers mean something, combined with the impossibility of ever knowing what. You can record them, analyze them, track them, correlate them with world events, and still you're on the outside. The information is right there, transmitted clearly enough that even a cheap radio picks it up. Yet it's as inaccessible as if locked in the deepest vault. Somewhere, someone applied their one-time pad to that transmission and now knows something you never will. Maybe they know where to go for a meeting. Maybe they know what documents to photograph. Maybe they know it's time to disappear, that their cover is blown, that they need to reach an extraction point before counterintelligence finds them. The numbers told them something urgent enough to justify maintaining this entire broadcasting infrastructure, this network of transmitters and scheduled transmissions and agents listening in lonely rooms with radios and pads they'll destroy after reading. Some stations have broadcast for so long they've become fixtures of the shortwave landscape, expected and monitored by enthusiasts who note every variation. When the Lincolnshire poacher fell silent, the community that had tracked it for years felt the absence like a missing tooth, a gap where something significant had been. When new stations appear, using identifiers no one's heard before, speculation runs wild about what nation launched them, what operations they're coordinating, whether their appearance correlates with geopolitical tensions or newly activated intelligence priorities. The community creates databases, archives recordings, maintains schedules of active stations. This crowdsourced surveillance of intelligence communications maps the shadow world more thoroughly than any official oversight could. Yet it reveals nothing about content, nothing about purpose beyond the obvious fact that secrets are being transmitted. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing you're listening to active espionage, that the transmission you're hearing might be instructing an agent to take actions that will affect world events, that someone's life or operation depends on receiving these numbers correctly. The stakes are invisible, but real. If an agent misses their scheduled broadcast, do they have backup protocols? If they copy the numbers wrong, does the decrypted message become gibberish, leaving them uncertain whether to act or wait for confirmation? If counterintelligence is listening, do they try to jam the signal? Or do they let it broadcast because locating the transmitter tells them less than identifying who's listening would? The technology seems almost quaint now, a relic of an era before encrypted smartphones and secure satellite links. Yet numbers stations haven't disappeared. They've adapted, incorporating digital modes and new transmission techniques. But the fundamental concept persists because it works. The agent transmits nothing, accesses nothing, does nothing that surveillance can detect except owning a radio, which is perfectly legal and completely common. The broadcast itself is public, deniable, and unbreakable without the pad. Modern encryption can be attacked through mathematical breakthroughs, implementation flaws, or computing advances. One-time pad encryption, properly implemented, is the only provably unbreakable cipher. As long as the pad is truly random, used only once, and kept secret, the message is absolutely secure, regardless of who intercepts it or what resources they apply to cracking it. Some broadcasts seem designed to confuse or overwhelm. Stations that transmit constantly, filling the spectrum with noise and numbers, making it harder to distinguish which transmissions are real and which might be deception. Broadcasts that follow patterns for years, then suddenly change format, identifier, or schedule. Stations that appear briefly, then disappear, leaving listeners uncertain whether they heard an actual intelligence transmission or something else entirely. The fog of uncertainty serves operational security. If counterintelligence can't reliably distinguish real agent communications from noise and deception, they can't efficiently focus resources on tracking the meaningful traffic. There are also anomalies that defy easy explanation, even from people who've studied number stations for decades. Broadcasts that don't fit typical patterns, transmissions using modulation or encoding that doesn't match known intelligence communication profiles, stations that appear in frequency ranges or formats that seem impractical for the supposed purpose. Are these experiments with new techniques? Cover for something else? Communications for purposes we haven't considered? The shortwave spectrum contains mysteries beyond even the acknowledged mystery of number stations themselves. Late at night, when atmospheric conditions allow shortwave signals to travel thousands of miles, when the spectrum fills with distant broadcasts from around the world, you can scan through and find them. The voices reading numbers in languages you don't speak. The tones pulsing in patterns that might encode information beyond the obvious audio. The stations that identify themselves with musical phrases or call signs that mean nothing to you, but everything to someone listening with a pad and pencil, ready to decode instructions that might send them into danger, that might save their life, that might be the last message they receive before something goes wrong and they're never heard from again. This is happening now, not in the past, not in spy novels, but right now on frequencies you can access. Someone is broadcasting, someone is listening, someone is decoding messages that you and I will never read, taking actions we'll never know about, playing roles in operations that remain secret, perhaps, forever. The numbers continue, mechanical and relentless, carrying meaning through the noise, connecting handlers to assets across hostile borders, and through surveillance that can intercept anything except information secured by mathematics and randomness. The voices read on into the darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, someone is writing down every number, knowing their life might depend on getting it exactly right. Project Looking Glass, technology that shows all possible futures. There's a persistent claim within conspiracy theory circles, and among certain alleged whistleblowers, that the United States government, possibly operating through classified programs at facilities like Area 51 or S4, possesses technology called Project Looking Glass, a device that allegedly allows operators to view probable future timelines by manipulating quantum probability fields, or by creating localized distortions in space-time that permit observation of events that haven't yet occurred from our temporal perspective. According to testimony from people claiming to have worked on or near the project, Looking Glass consists of a cylindrical apparatus, possibly involving rotating rings of exotic matter or electromagnetic field generators arranged to create specific space-time geometries, with a viewing screen or interface where operators can observe scenes from potential futures, witnessing outcomes of current decisions, seeing technological developments before they occur, observing catastrophes before they happen, essentially possessing a window into tomorrow that provides enormous strategic advantage to whoever controls it, the ability to make decisions with knowledge of their consequences, to avoid disasters by seeing them coming, to steal technological innovations by observing them in the future and developing them in the present, to win wars by knowing enemy actions before they're taken, to manipulate markets by foreseeing economic shifts, to control society by steering toward desired futures while avoiding timelines that contain undesirable outcomes. The existence of such technology would represent the ultimate information advantage, would explain certain prescient decisions or seemingly miraculous avoidance of catastrophes, would provide framework for understanding how elite groups might maintain power across generations, by possessing knowledge of future events that allows them to position themselves optimally while everyone else operates blind, making decisions based on incomplete information about probable outcomes, while the Looking Glass operators possess clarity about which choices lead where. But the evidence for Project Looking Glass consists entirely of whistleblower testimony from individuals whose credentials are difficult to verify, whose access to classified programs can't be independently confirmed, and whose descriptions of the technology are vague enough to avoid specific falsifiable claims while dramatic enough to capture imagination, creating a situation where Looking Glass exists in permanent evidential limbo. Either the most significant classified technology in human possession, proving that future viewing is possible and that powerful groups have been using this capability to shape history according to their preferences, or an elaborate fiction, a story that combines real classified program names with fictional capabilities, that borrows from legitimate physics concepts about time and probability, while applying them in ways that actual physics doesn't support, that serves the conspiracy theory purpose of explaining why elites seem to always win, why certain groups maintain power despite apparent disadvantages, why history sometimes unfolds in ways that seem too convenient or too orchestrated to be mere chance, providing narrative framework where everything is planned, where accident and chaos are illusions, where those in control are operating with knowledge of future outcomes that makes their success inevitable rather than achieved through the messy contingent processes of actual history, leaving Project Looking Glass as either suppressed scientific breakthrough that proves time isn't linear and that future observation is achievable through sufficiently advanced technology, or as mythology, as story that believers in conspiracy need to be true to make sense of world, where power concentrates despite democratic institutions, where elite coordination seems too effective to be mere networking and shared interest, where the alternative, that Looking Glass doesn't exist and elites are just wealthy humans making educated guesses and sometimes getting lucky, feels less satisfying than believing in secret technology that explains everything. The primary source for Project Looking Glass claims is Dan Burisch, also known as Dan Crane, who emerged in the early 2000s claiming to be a microbiologist who had worked on classified projects at Area 51 and S4, who had been exposed to various secret programs, including one involving time viewing technology. Burisch provided detailed accounts of Looking Glass in interviews, describing it as a cylindrical device several meters long, involving rotating components, creating what he described as an Einstein-Rosen bridge, or controlled wormhole that could be tuned to observe different probable future timelines. He claimed that multiple Looking Glass devices existed, that they were built using technology reverse-engineered from extraterrestrial craft, or that they were developed through black-budget physics programs that achieved breakthroughs far beyond publicly acknowledged science. According to Burisch, Looking Glass showed operators that all observed futures converged toward a specific event or timeline convergence in the early 21st century, beyond which the futures diverged dramatically into either catastrophic or transcendent outcomes for humanity. This convergence point allegedly limited the device's usefulness because futures beyond it were unstable or couldn't be clearly observed, creating strategic problem for those using the technology. They could see consequences of current actions only up to this convergence point, beyond which all timelines became chaotic or uncertain, suggesting that humanity faced a crucial juncture where decisions made would determine which of the divergent post-convergence futures would manifest. The physics that would be required for Looking Glass to function as described doesn't exist in any verified form. Observing future events would require either faster-than-light information transfer, which relativity forbids, or would require that futures already exist in some sense, that time is block universe where past, present, and future coexist, and Looking Glass is simply a device for directing observation toward the future sections of the block. Even accepting block universe interpretation, the mechanism by which electromagnetic fields or rotating components could shift observation through time isn't described by any known physics. The Einstein-Rosen bridge, mentioned by Burisch, is real concept from general relativity, a theoretical connection between distant points in space-time, commonly called a wormhole. But whether such structures can actually form, whether they could be stabilized, and whether they could be used for information transfer or observation, much less for viewing future events, remains entirely speculative and faces severe theoretical obstacles. The quantum probability interpretation that some Looking Glass accounts invoke suggests the device isn't viewing a predetermined future, but rather sampling from probability distributions, observing possible futures weighted by their likelihood, similar to many worlds interpretation, where all quantum possibilities branch into separate realities. In this framework, Looking Glass would show operators the most probable outcomes, given current conditions, allowing them to adjust variables to steer toward preferred probability branches. But this doesn't align with how quantum mechanics actually functions at macroscopic scales. Quantum indeterminacy averages out in large systems, making the future probabilistically predictable through normal analysis, rather than requiring exotic viewing technology. Classical chaos theory and complex systems modeling provide methods for forecasting probable futures without invoking quantum mechanics or time viewing technology. The strategic implications if Looking Glass exists would be profound. Any government or group possessing reliable future viewing technology would have insurmountable advantage over those without it. Military conflicts would be won before they started by side that could foresee enemy actions. Economic markets would be dominated by those who could see future prices and developments. Political battles would be controlled by those who could test messages and policies by observing their future effects. The technology would be so valuable that its very existence would be the most closely guarded secret, protected at any cost, because losing it or allowing adversaries to develop their own version would eliminate the advantage it provides. This raises the question of why, if Looking Glass exists, the United States or whoever possesses it hasn't achieved complete global domination. If you can see all possible futures and choose actions that lead to preferred outcomes, you should be effectively omniscient within the time range the technology permits viewing. The fact that geopolitical competition continues, that US strategic initiatives sometimes fail, that unexpected events occur that seemingly could have been foreseen and prevented, suggests either that Looking Glass doesn't exist, or that its capabilities are far more limited than the dramatic description suggests, or that other powers possess similar technology, creating a stalemate where everyone can see futures. But no one gains decisive advantage because all players are operating with similar information. The convergence point that Burish describes, a moment beyond which futures become chaotic and unpredictable, provides narrative explanation for why Looking Glass hasn't prevented all problems or created perfect control. If the technology only works up to a certain temporal horizon, and if we're currently near or past that horizon, then its utility would be limited. The convergence could represent limitations in the technology itself, or could represent actual properties of time and causality, where prediction becomes impossible beyond certain complexity thresholds, or where quantum indeterminacy accumulated over time makes futures genuinely undetermined beyond specific temporal distance. The connection to extraterrestrial technology that appears in some Looking Glass accounts places the device within broader UFO conspiracy narratives. If Looking Glass was reverse engineered from alien craft, it implies that advanced civilizations possess time viewing capabilities, that such technology is achievable given sufficient scientific advancement, and that humans have gained access to it through recovered alien equipment rather than through our own research breakthroughs. This narrative serves to explain how humans could possess technology that seems to require physics far beyond our current understanding. We didn't develop it ourselves. We copied it from beings with thousands or millions of years of advancement beyond us. But this explanation requires accepting the premise that alien craft have been recovered, that reverse engineering alien technology is feasible despite the likely enormous gap in scientific principles and engineering approaches, and that the resulting device works despite humans not fully understanding the physics that underlies its operation. Each of these premises is controversial and unsupported by public evidence, making the alien origin story for Looking Glass depend on accepting multiple extraordinary claims that are themselves disputed. The alternative explanation is that Project Looking Glass exists as a real program name, but that the capabilities attributed to it are misunderstood or misrepresented. Classified research into various exotic physics concepts, wormholes, time dilation effects, quantum computing applications to forecasting, might operate under code names that include Looking Glass. Whistleblowers with partial access or understanding might conflate separate programs, might misinterpret what they saw or were told, might elaborate based on speculation rather than direct knowledge, creating accounts that mix real program names and real physics concepts with fictional capabilities that sound plausible to non-experts, but that don't match what the actual classified research achieved. The Project Preserve Destiny name appears in some accounts alongside or interchangeably with Looking Glass, sometimes described as overlapping programs or as different code names for the same technology at different periods. The proliferation of names and the variations in descriptions across different whistleblower accounts suggest either a complex history of multiple related programs with different capabilities and designations, or suggest that the accounts are elaborations and variations on a theme, rather than consistent testimony about a single, real technology. The societal control implications are central to why LookingGlass features in conspiracy theories. If government or elite groups possess future viewing technology, it transforms democracy and free will into theater. The outcomes are already known. Decisions are made by those with access to LookingGlass who can see consequences, and the public participation in governance is meaningless because those in control are operating with information advantage so profound that manipulation is trivial. Every election, every policy debate, every social movement occurs within framework shaped by those who can see futures and steer society toward timelines they prefer. This narrative is psychologically appealing to conspiracy theorists because it provides totalizing explanation for complexity and inequality. The world isn't messy and chaotic with distributed power and genuine uncertainty about futures. Instead, it's controlled and predicted by hidden elite using suppressed technology. This explanation makes history comprehensible as planned sequence rather than as emergent property of millions of independent actors making decisions with limited information. It replaces chaos with control, accident with design, complexity with conspiracy. But evidence for LookingGlass remains elusive. Burish's testimony is detailed and internally consistent within his narrative, but his credentials have been questioned. His claimed positions at classified facilities can't be independently verified, and no physical evidence or documentation has been produced beyond his testimony and testimony from others in the same conspiracy theory communities. The accounts exist in an ecosystem where verification is impossible. The programs are too classified. The witnesses are threatened or suppressed. The evidence is destroyed or remains hidden in facilities that public researchers can't access. Every absence of evidence is explained as successful suppression, rather than as indication that the claims might be false. The question of whether we should want LookingGlass to exist is ethically complex. Future viewing technology could prevent catastrophes, could allow optimization of decisions for human benefit, could reduce suffering by allowing problems to be foreseen and addressed before they occur. But it could also enable unprecedented control, could eliminate genuine free will and uncertainty that many philosophers consider essential to meaning and ethics, could create two-tier society where those with access to future knowledge dominate those without. The technology would be so powerful that its misuse would be catastrophic, making it potentially more dangerous than beneficial, unless its control and use were perfectly ethical, which no human institution has ever achieved. Whether Project LookingGlass exists as described, exists in limited form far less dramatic than whistleblower accounts suggest, or doesn't exist at all and represents mythology that serves conspiracy theory purposes by providing explanation for elite power and coordination. The story demonstrates human fascination with time, with future knowledge, with the possibility of gaining information advantage that would transform powerlessness into control, uncertainty into confidence, chaos into predictability. The desire for LookingGlass to exist reflects desire to believe that someone knows what's coming, that history isn't random but planned, that the future isn't fundamentally uncertain but is knowable to those with right technology, even if we're not among those privileged few with access. The story persists because it can't be definitively disproven. Classified programs by definition don't have publicly accessible documentation. Suppressed technology, by definition, doesn't appear in scientific literature. And whistleblowers telling truth about highly classified breakthrough technology would face exactly the credibility problems and verification obstacles that LookingGlass witnesses face, making legitimate disclosure indistinguishable from fabrication unless physical evidence can be produced, which whistleblowers claim is impossible due to classification and security. This creates perfect, unfalsifiable conspiracy theory. All confirming evidence is suppressed. All disconfirming evidence is explained away. Belief or disbelief depends entirely on prior probability assessments about whether such technology is plausible and whether governments would develop and conceal it. Project LookingGlass remains what it has been since the claims first circulated, either the most significant classified technology in existence, proving that future viewing is achievable and that powerful groups have used this capability to shape history while keeping humanity ignorant of time's true nature and the malleability of destiny. Or a compelling fiction, a story that combines classified program nomenclature with speculative physics and conspiracy theory to create narrative that explains too much, that accounts for elite power through suppressed technology rather than through the mundane mechanisms of wealth, networks, information, asymmetry, and institutional advantage, leaving LookingGlass suspended between extraordinary truth and elaborate fiction, between classified breakthrough and mythological projection, between the device that shows all possible futures and the story that shows all possible conspiracy theories, existing in permanent uncertainty. Because verification requires access that isn't available. Because the extraordinary claims lack extraordinary evidence. Because whistleblower testimony without physical proof or corroboration creates belief rather than knowledge, faith rather than certainty, leaving those who encounter the LookingGlass story to decide for themselves whether time-viewing technology exists in classified facilities, whether operators right now are observing futures and making decisions based on knowledge of consequences, whether history is guided by those who can see tomorrow, or whether LookingGlass is myth, is legend, is the conspiracy theory that makes elite power comprehensible by attributing it to suppressed technology, rather than to the complex emergent properties of human societies, where power concentrates through mechanisms that don't require future-viewing devices, where decisions are made with uncertainty and imperfect information by everyone including the powerful, where the future remains genuinely unknown to all, where Project LookingGlass exists not as technology, but as story, as explanation, as the narrative that makes conspiracy theorists comfortable with worlds they can't otherwise understand, giving them framework where everything is planned and controlled rather than chaotic and contingent, where someone knows what's coming even if that someone isn't them, where the LookingGlass operators guide history toward predetermined outcomes while the rest of us live in ignorance, believing we're making choices that matter when the futures have already been observed and decisions have already been made by those with access to technology that shouldn't exist but that allegedly does. Technology that remains forever just beyond proof, forever just beyond verification, forever suspended in testimonial claims that can't be confirmed or denied without access to classified programs that may contain Project LookingGlass, or may contain nothing, may show all possible futures, or may show nothing at all except the human tendency to create myths about secret technology that explains why power concentrates and why elites win, why history unfolds as it does, and why ordinary people feel powerless, answered not by LookingGlass technology that doesn't exist, but by boring reality of wealth and institutions and information asymmetry that doesn't require exotic physics or time-viewing devices, leaving Project LookingGlass as permanent question, permanent possibility, permanent conspiracy theory that will continue circulating, continue being believed by some and dismissed by others, continue serving its function of explaining the inexplicable by invoking suppressed technology. continue existing in the space between classified truth and elaborate fiction, where verification is impossible and where belief depends not on evidence, but on prior commitments about whether such technology could exist, whether governments would develop it, whether whistleblowers are telling truth or constructing mythology, whether the future is knowable or fundamentally uncertain, whether Project Looking Glass shows all possible futures or shows nothing because it exists or because it was always just story, always just legend, always just the conspiracy theory about technology that sees tomorrow. Phantom time, hypothesis, 300 years that never happened. What if the year isn't actually 2025, but 1728? What if nearly 3 centuries of history that we've been taught actually never occurred? Were completely fabricated, inserted into the timeline by a conspiracy so vast and so successful that it convinced the entire world that events happened, people lived, and empires rose and fell during a period that was actually just blank space, empty time that was papered over with invented chronicles and forged documents. This is the phantom time hypothesis, proposed by German historian Heribert Illig in 1991, suggesting that the years between 614 and 911 AD never happened, that approximately 297 years were added to the calendar through deliberate falsification coordinated between Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. According to this theory, they wanted to position themselves at the symbolically significant year 1000 AD, rather than the actual year 703. So they simply added centuries to the timeline, invented historical figures and events to populate those centuries, forged documents and artifacts to support the narrative, and succeeded so thoroughly that every culture and civilization on Earth somehow accepted this fabricated chronology without anyone noticing or preserving accurate records that would contradict it. The implications are staggering. If Illig is correct, then Charlemagne never existed. The early Islamic conquests didn't happen as described, and entire architectural marvels attributed to the Dark Ages were actually built in completely different time periods by cultures we've misidentified because we're operating from a timeline that's off by 300 years. The hypothesis originates from Illig's observation that the period between roughly 600 and 900 AD, what we call the early Middle Ages or Dark Ages, has suspicious characteristics that make it seem less historically substantial than the periods before and after it. There's a relative scarcity of contemporary documents from this era, architecture, and artifacts that appear to be from earlier or later periods contaminating the archaeological record, and what Illig interprets as a fundamental discontinuity in cultural and technological development that suggests something is wrong with the chronology. If you removed those 300 years from the timeline, he argues, the progression from late antiquity to the high Middle Ages makes more sense, flows more naturally without the problematic Dark Age interruption that has always puzzled historians trying to explain why civilizations seem to regress dramatically before recovering. The motivation Illig proposes is both political and religious. The year 1000 AD held enormous symbolic significance in Christian eschatology. It represented the millennium, the 1,000-year anniversary of Christ's birth, a numerologically perfect moment that rulers would want to claim for their reigns. Otto III crowned emperor in 996, Sylvester II becoming pope in 999. Both men were scholars interested in calendrical reform, and both stood to gain tremendously from positioning themselves as rulers during this momentous year. If the actual date was 703 by accurate count, but they wanted their reigns to coincide with the year 1000, the solution would be to simply add the missing years to the calendar, to declare that the year was actually 996, and that the previous 3 centuries had occurred even though they hadn't, filling those phantom centuries with invented history that would justify and legitimize the new chronology. The mechanism for pulling off such a fraud would require coordinating the falsification across multiple domains. Documents would need to be forged or backdated, chronicles and letters claiming to be from the phantom centuries, giving them apparent historical authenticity. Artifacts would need to be misdated or deliberately created to appear older than they actually were. Architectural structures would need to be attributed to periods when they weren't actually built. And crucially, every culture, every nation, every record-keeping system across Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond would need to either participate in the conspiracy or somehow fail to notice or preserve evidence that the chronology was wrong. This is where the hypothesis becomes difficult for many historians to accept. The scale of coordination and the thoroughness of the deception required seem implausible to the point of impossibility. But Illig points to specific evidence he argues supports the hypothesis. The scarcity of physical evidence from the Phantom period is one element. Archaeological findings from 600 to 900 AD are disproportionately rare compared to earlier and later periods. Contemporary written sources are suspiciously limited, with many accounts from that era actually being later copies or compositions that might have been created after the fact to fill in a timeline that needed historical content. The donation of Constantine, a document supposedly from the 4th century, granting the Pope temporal authority, was proven to be a forgery from a much later period. If one document of enormous historical significance was fabricated, might the entire concept of fabricating historical documents to support political and religious agendas be more widespread than we acknowledge? Carbon dating is often cited as evidence against phantom time. We can date materials scientifically and establish chronologies that should be independent of historical records. But Illig argues that carbon dating calibration depends on dendrochronology, tree ring dating, which itself depends on establishing reference chronologies that assume the historical timeline is correct. If the timeline is wrong, the calibration is circular, using the incorrect historical record to calibrate a supposedly independent scientific dating method, which then confirms the historical record it was calibrated against. This creates a closed loop where the error perpetuates itself through every system we use to verify dates. The Gregorian calendar reform in 1582 is another element Illig examines. Pope Gregory XIII corrected a drift between the calendar and the astronomical year, but the correction was for approximately 10 days, when the actual drift should have been closer to 13 days, given the rate of drift and the time elapsed since the Julian calendar was implemented. Illig suggests this discrepancy might indicate that fewer years actually passed than the historical chronology claims, that the calendar drift reflects the real time elapsed rather than the fabricated timeline, and that the smaller than expected correction is evidence that 3 centuries of phantom time had been inserted and weren't actually accumulating calendar drift because they never actually occurred. Architectural evidence is cited both for and against the hypothesis. Romanesque architecture appears rather suddenly in the historical record around the year 1000, as if it had no developmental period. Illig suggests that Romanesque architecture was actually developing during what we're told is the late Roman period, and that the phantom centuries create an artificial gap in the architectural record that makes it seem like styles appeared without precedent when actually the intervening time never happened, and the sudden appearance reflects continuous development that only seems interrupted because of the inserted phantom time. The hypothesis faces severe criticism from mainstream historians and scientists. The problem of coordination is insurmountable in most scholars' view. How do you convince Islamic civilizations, the Byzantine Empire, Chinese dynasties, and countless other independent record-keeping societies across the world to all adopt a falsified chronology. Islamic sources have their own calendrical systems and historical records that should be independent of European Christian calendar manipulation. Yet they document events and dates that correspond with the European timeline when converted. Chinese astronomical records from the period record events, like eclipses and comets, that can be independently verified through astronomical modeling, confirming that those years occurred when the historical chronology claims they did. Documents that can be scientifically dated to the phantom period through methods independent of calibration against historical chronology also pose problems for the hypothesis. Volcanic eruptions leave traces in ice cores that can be counted back year by year, providing absolute chronology that should be independent of human calendars. These ice core records don't show a 300-year discrepancy with the historical timeline. Astronomical events mentioned in texts can be dated precisely through celestial mechanics calculations that don't depend on accepting any particular chronology. And these also align with the traditional timeline, rather than suggesting it's off by 3 centuries. The hypothesis has been expanded and modified by various proponents, with some suggesting smaller amounts of phantom time or different periods that were fabricated. Some focus on specific regions or dynasties, rather than claiming a global conspiracy. But the core phantom time hypothesis, as Illig proposed, it claims a specific 300-year period was entirely invented, which requires either accepting that the conspiracy was more vast and more successful than any other historical deception, or that all the various independent verification methods are flawed in ways that happen to produce the same incorrect timeline. Charlemagne is a central figure in the debate because he supposedly lived and ruled during the heart of the Phantom period. Illig suggests Charlemagne is a complete fabrication, an invented ruler whose story combines elements from earlier and later figures, created to populate the empty timeline with a suitably impressive emperor who could serve as a historical anchor point for the fabricated chronology. The evidence for Charlemagne's existence, documents, contemporary accounts, architectural projects attributed to his reign, is all dismissed as later fabrication or misdated material from different periods. For mainstream historians, Charlemagne's historicity is well established through multiple independent sources, making his complete fabrication essentially impossible. For phantom time proponents, the lack of truly contemporary physical evidence and the suspicious perfection of his legendary status suggests he's too good to be true, an invented ideal rather than a real person. The psychological appeal of the phantom time hypothesis is worth considering. It suggests that consensus reality is wrong in a fundamental way, that everyone has been fooled by a massive deception, that you can be smart enough to see through it, where billions of others have been duped. This is attractive to certain mindsets, providing the satisfaction of secret knowledge and the elevation of being one of the few who understands the truth. It also feeds into distrust of authorities and institutions. If they lied about 300 years of history, what else are they lying about? But the hypothesis also raises interesting questions about history and chronology, even if the specific claim is false. How much confidence should we have in timelines derived from documents that have been copied and recopied through centuries? How do we know that the versions we have are accurate to the originals? How much historical knowledge is actually circular, with different sources corroborating each other, not because they're independent, but because later sources copied earlier ones, creating the illusion of independent confirmation? Even if 300 years weren't invented wholesale, are there smaller falsifications and errors that have accumulated in the historical record, making our understanding of the past less accurate than we assume? The phenomenon of chronological revision is actually well documented on smaller scales. Dates have been corrected as better evidence emerges. Historical figures once thought to exist have been proven to be legendary or composite. Documents once considered authentic have been revealed as forgeries. So the concept of chronology being wrong isn't absurd in principle. It's only the scale Illig proposes that makes the phantom time hypothesis hard for mainstream academia to accept. If he claimed 50 years were invented, or that a specific dynasty's chronology was inflated, it would be more plausible, even if still controversial. 300 years affecting the entire world is where the hypothesis stretches credibility beyond what evidence can support. Testing the hypothesis definitively is challenging because any evidence against it can be dismissed by proponents as part of the fabrication or as calibrated against the false chronology and therefore invalid. This makes it essentially unfalsifiable from the believer's perspective. Every attempt to disprove it is explained away as contaminated by the very conspiracy it's trying to test. This is a characteristic of many alternative historical theories and makes productive debate difficult because there's no evidence that would be accepted as conclusive disproof. The cultural impact of the hypothesis has been modest. It's known in alternative history communities and among those interested in chronological controversies, but it hasn't achieved mainstream acceptance or seriously challenged academic consensus about the historical timeline. It serves more as a thought experiment and a fringe theory that raises interesting questions about how we establish historical knowledge, even if the specific claim about phantom centuries is almost certainly false. What the phantom time hypothesis does effectively is demonstrate how much of what we know about the past depends on trust. Trust in documents, trust in institutions that preserve and interpret them, trust in methods of dating and verification. If that trust is misplaced, if there are systematic errors or deliberate deceptions in the chain of evidence, then our understanding of history could be dramatically wrong. Illig asks us to consider that possibility in the most extreme form, suggesting 300 years of fabrication. And while most historians find the evidence for that specific claim insufficient, the underlying question remains valid. How do we know the history we've been taught is accurate? What would it look like if it wasn't? And how would we detect a falsification that was thorough and coordinated enough to fool everyone for centuries? Whether the phantom time hypothesis is a legitimate historical controversy or an elaborate misunderstanding of how historical evidence works, it represents a fascinating challenge to consensus chronology. A suggestion that time itself, as we understand it, might be a construction, that the years we count might not correspond to years that actually elapsed, that history as written might contain not just errors and biases, but wholesale fabrications that have become so embedded in our understanding of the past that questioning them seems absurd, even though, if they existed, that absolute confidence in their truth would be exactly what you'd expect from a successful historical fraud. The calendar says it's 2025. Heribert Illig says it's 1728. Mainstream historians say Illig is wrong and can prove it through multiple independent verification methods. But late at night, when you think about how much of what you know about the past you've never actually verified yourself, about how you trust documents and dates because authorities tell you they're accurate, about how a conspiracy that succeeded completely would look exactly like consensus reality, because consensus reality is what it would have created. The phantom time hypothesis whispers that maybe, just maybe, 300 years of history never happened, were invented by rulers who wanted to position themselves at a symbolically perfect moment in time, and succeeded so thoroughly that more than 1,000 years later, we still believe in centuries that were actually empty, still count years that never occurred, still date events to a timeline that's off by 3 centuries, still trust a historical narrative that was fabricated by people who understood that if you control the past, you control the present. And if you control the calendar, you control time itself. Making everyone believe they're living in the year 2025, when the real year, the accurate count of time that's actually elapsed since the point we call year zero, might be something quite different, something several centuries earlier, meaning we're all living in the wrong time, believing in a chronology that was invented, trusting a timeline that was fabricated, and accepting without question centuries of history that Heribert Illig insists never happened at all. Black-eyed children, entities that knock on doors at night. There's a knock on your door late at night, hours after any reasonable person would be making social calls, when the neighborhood is dark and silent, and you're preparing for bed. You weren't expecting anyone. You approach cautiously, look through the peephole or window, and see children standing on your porch. They're young, maybe 10 to 14 years old, dressed normally, standing still with an unnatural patience that immediately feels wrong. Something about them triggers every instinct to not open that door, to pretend you're not home, to back away quietly. But they knock again. And when you get a better look at their faces, when light catches their eyes, you realize why your nervous system is screaming danger. Their eyes are completely black. No whites, no iris, no pupil you can distinguish from the surrounding darkness. Just solid black from edge to edge, like someone filled the eye sockets with ink or cut holes through their faces into an empty void. These are the black-eyed children, and according to hundreds of encounters reported over the past 3 decades, if you make the mistake of inviting them inside, something terrible happens that survivors struggle to articulate. Something that changes you in ways that can't be easily explained or undone. The phenomenon entered widespread awareness in 1998 when journalist Brian Bethel posted his encounter to an internet forum. He'd been sitting in his parked car in Abilene, Texas, writing a check when he noticed 2 boys approaching. They were dressed in hoodies, appearing about 10 and 14 years old, moving toward his vehicle with deliberate purpose. When they reached his window, the older one asked for a ride home, explaining they wanted to see a movie but had left their money at home and needed to retrieve it. The request was innocuous enough, but Bethel described overwhelming terror flooding through him for no reason he could identify. Something was catastrophically wrong. Then he looked at their eyes, completely black, both children, solid darkness, where eyes should show white in color. He felt compelled to unlock the door despite his terror, his hand actually moving toward the lock as if someone else was controlling it, while the older child became more insistent. "We can't come in unless you let us. Let us in. We need to come in." Bethel snapped out of the compulsion, started his car, and drove away, while the children watched expressionlessly. No disappointment or anger showing on their faces. Just blank observation as he escaped. Since Bethel's account, hundreds of similar reports have surfaced from around the world, sharing disturbing consistency despite coming from people who've never communicated, who live in different countries, who have no apparent connection except the experience of being approached by children with completely black eyes. The encounters follow patterns that suggest this isn't random hallucination or individual psychological breakdown, but something actually occurring, some phenomenon that manifests through these child forms to interact with humans in ways that serve purposes we don't understand and probably shouldn't. The children always appear in pairs or small groups, never alone. They're typically between ages 10 and 17 in appearance, though their behavior suggests they're not actually children despite the forms they wear. They dress in ordinary clothing, jeans, hoodies, t-shirts, nothing that would draw attention or mark them as unusual except for their eyes. Their skin is often described as waxy or pale, with texture that doesn't quite look alive, though this isn't always obvious until you're close enough that backing away becomes difficult. They appear at doors, usually at night, but sometimes during twilight hours, knocking persistently with a rhythm that witnesses describe as mechanical, as if they're performing a gesture they've observed but don't fully understand. The requests they make are always variations on the same theme. They need to come inside. They need a phone to call their parents. They need a ride somewhere. They need help. The specific excuse varies, but the underlying demand is consistent. You must invite them in. You must grant them access. You must open the barrier that separates them from your space. And critically, they can't or won't enter without permission. This limitation appears absolute across all reported encounters. They can ask, they can pressure, they can use compulsion techniques that make you feel you should let them in, but they cannot cross the threshold uninvited. Something prevents them, some rule they're bound by, that might be their only weakness. The compulsion aspect is what makes encounters so dangerous. Multiple witnesses describe feeling an overwhelming urge to comply with the children's requests, despite every rational instinct screaming not to. It's not that the children are particularly persuasive in any normal sense. Their speech is often flat and repetitive, lacking the natural emotional cadence human children use when asking for help. But something about their presence affects decision-making, creates an almost hypnotic pressure to do what they ask. People find their hands moving toward door locks, their mouths forming words of agreement, their bodies responding to instructions their minds are desperately trying to reject. The compulsion isn't perfect. People do resist it, do manage to refuse entry and close doors, or drive away. But it requires active effort, conscious fight against something that wants you to surrender your will and let them in. What happens if you do let them in is where accounts become fragmented and disturbing. Very few people who've granted access have come forward with detailed reports, which might mean they're too traumatized to discuss it. They don't remember what occurred, or they didn't survive the encounter in ways that allow them to report. The secondhand accounts and partial testimonies that do exist describe rapid deterioration of the person who invited them inside. They become withdrawn, terrified to be alone, reporting that the children didn't leave, that they're still in the house somehow, even though they're not visible. They develop physical symptoms, extreme fatigue, nosebleeds, bruising without cause. Some claim they wake up in different locations than where they fell asleep, with missing time they can't account for. Others report that the children visit them repeatedly now, appearing in their homes without knocking, standing at the foot of their beds at night, following them through daily life, just at the edge of vision. The black eyes themselves are beyond unnatural. They're not contact lenses or makeup. Witnesses who see them up close describe them as impossibly dark, as if you're looking into depth rather than at a surface, as if the eyes are holes that go somewhere else. Some report seeing movement in the blackness, shapes or shadows shifting as if things are moving in the depths. Others describe the eyes as reflective in ways that don't match physics, catching light strangely or seeming to emit their own faint luminescence. Looking into them creates profound psychological distress, as if you're making eye contact with something that understands you completely, that sees through every defense and pretense, that recognizes your food or prey or resource, and is patient enough to wait for you to make the mistake of granting access. Children are inherently trusted in most cultures. We're wired to respond to juvenile features with protection and assistance. The black-eyed children exploit this, using forms that should trigger helping behavior while radiating enough wrongness that the conflict between instinct to help and instinct to flee creates paralysis. This might be the point. The confusion and cognitive dissonance weaken decision-making, make people more susceptible to the compulsion, increase the likelihood they'll make the fatal mistake of opening the door or unlocking the car, despite knowing at some level that they absolutely shouldn't. The locations of encounters vary but show some patterns. Residential doorsteps at night are most common, suggesting the entities specifically target people in their homes, in spaces where they feel safe and are less guarded. But encounters also occur in parked cars, at gas stations, in hotels, anywhere someone is in a contained space that requires granting access. The children adapt their requests to the situation. At a house, they need to use your phone. In a car, they need a ride. At a hotel, they've locked themselves out of their room and need you to let them into yours to call their parents. The specificity of the request, tailored to the situation, suggests intelligence and intentionality, not random manifestation, but targeted approach. Some encounters include adults accompanying the black-eyed children, figures who also have the solid black eyes, but appear in adult forms. These are rarer in reports, but their presence suggests a hierarchy or organization, that the children might be the primary interface, but there are adult equivalents who sometimes accompany them or handle situations where child forms would be ineffective. This expands the phenomenon beyond just children to suggest a species or group that can manifest in multiple human age categories, always with the distinctive black eyes, always seeking invitation and access. The theories about what they are range across every framework humans use to explain the inexplicable. The supernatural interpretation identifies them as demons or malevolent spirits that require invitation to enter human spaces, bound by spiritual laws that prevent them from crossing thresholds without permission. The black eyes mark them as not human, as entities wearing human disguise imperfectly, getting most details right but failing at the eyes, which are supposedly windows to the soul and perhaps can't be faked by beings that don't have human souls. In this framework, inviting them in grants spiritual access, permission that allows them to attach to you, possess you, drain your life force, or claim some aspect of your being that they can't take without consent. The extraterrestrial theory suggests they're alien-human hybrids, beings created through genetic manipulation that blend alien genetics with human appearance. The black eyes might be their natural state, or might result from hybrid biology that doesn't quite work properly, leaving them with eyes that function but don't look right. They approach humans perhaps as part of ongoing study or resource extraction, needing voluntary access to implant monitoring devices, extract genetic material, or conduct experiments that require the subject's consent for reasons relating to universal laws or technological limitations we don't understand. Interdimensional theories propose their beings from parallel realities that can briefly manifest in our dimension, but need human permission or interaction to stabilize their presence. The threshold between spaces, a doorway, a car door, any barrier that defines inside and outside, might represent the dimensional boundary they're trying to cross. And human consent somehow provides the energy or authorization needed for them to fully transition into our reality. The black eyes could be what happens when eyes from another dimension are viewed in ours, the appearance our brains generate when trying to process visual organs that don't properly translate into our physics. There are also darker theories suggesting government experimentation, children subjected to genetic or consciousness modification that left them changed, perhaps used as agents or weapons that exploit human compassion and trust. The black eyes might result from procedures that altered their neurology or installed technology that uses the eye sockets. They seek access to homes to gather intelligence, install surveillance, or test psychological weapons on unsuspecting populations. This frames them as victims and weapons simultaneously. Children who were human once, but have been transformed into something that serves purposes their handlers programmed into them. The vampiric parallel is obvious and perhaps intentional. Classic vampire mythology requires the creature to be invited across the threshold before it can enter and harm you. The black-eyed children follow this same limitation, as if they're updated versions of that archetype, adapted for modern culture where vampires are romanticized rather than feared. By appearing as children, they bypass the adult threat presentation while maintaining the fundamental rules. They can pressure and compel, but the threshold holds unless you grant passage. And like vampires, the encounter doesn't end after they leave or you refuse them. There are reports of them returning night after night to the same location, knocking at the same door, making the same requests, wearing down resistance until the exhausted homeowner finally gives in, just to make it stop. Children also represent innocence lost or corrupted, and encounters with the black-eyed children often leave witnesses with profound unease about children in general, about what might be hiding behind any young face, about whether the children they see in daily life are actually human, or might be more of these entities moving through society undetected. This psychological contamination might be part of the purpose, not just the immediate interaction, but the lasting damaged trust and certainty, the implanted doubt that spreads through communities as people share their experiences and start looking at every child with suspicion. The phenomenon has intensified with internet connectivity. More people are aware of black-eyed children encounters. More reports surface and circulate, creating feedback loops where the phenomenon becomes more widely known and possibly more frequently experienced. This could be simply better reporting. Encounters that previously went undocumented or were dismissed as individual delusion now get shared and recognized as part of a pattern. Or it could be that awareness itself affects manifestation frequency, that these entities become more active or more able to manifest when more people believe in them, when the cultural consciousness creates space for them to exist. Skeptics argue the entire phenomenon is internet legend, creepypasta that people have internalized and now experience through false memories, sleep paralysis, hallucinations, or intentional hoaxes. The consistency of reports could reflect shared cultural narratives rather than shared encounters with actual entities. We're pattern-seeking creatures, and once a story template exists, we unconsciously shape ambiguous experiences to fit that template. A strange child at your door becomes a black-eyed child in memory, because that narrative is available and provides explanation for the unease you felt. But this explanation struggles with certain elements. The encounters include details witnesses didn't expect, reactions they didn't consciously control, physical effects that persist beyond the psychological. The compulsion to invite them in isn't something people report wanting to experience or believe they'd feel. The absolute nature of the threshold restriction across all reports suggests operational reality rather than narrative convention. And the fact that encounters continue to be reported by people who've never heard of the phenomenon until after their experience, who come to online communities searching for explanation for what happened to them and are shocked to find hundreds of similar accounts, indicates something beyond simple cultural transmission of folklore. What the black-eyed children want, if they're real, remains unclear. Access is the immediate goal, but access to what and for what purpose? Do they feed on fear, on life energy, on something humans possess that they need? Are they collecting people, harvesting something from those who let them in? Are they scouts for invasion, testing human defenses and gathering intelligence? Are they lost, genuinely needing help, but unable to ask in ways that don't trigger terror, because their nature is so fundamentally different from ours that communication fails? The possibilities range from predatory to tragic, from malevolent to merely alien, and we have no way to determine which is accurate without taking the risk of letting them in and discovering firsthand what they do with the access we've granted. What's certain is that if you hear a knock at your door late at night, if you see children standing there with requests that don't quite make sense, if something makes you hesitate before opening that door, despite them being just kids who need help, Trust that instinct absolutely. Look at their eyes. If they're black, solid black, with no white visible, do not open the door. Do not invite them in. Do not let them into your car. Do not grant any access to your space, no matter how much you feel compelled to help them, no matter how insistent they become, no matter how cruel it seems to refuse children in need. Because they're not children, not in any way that matters. And whatever they are has learned that appearing in child form with black eyes that suggest something wrong underneath gets them close enough to use compulsion and pressure, and that eventually, statistically, someone always opens the door, someone always lets them in, and those people either don't talk about what happened next or can't, leaving only gaps in the data where testimony should be, silence where there should be warning, and the black-eyed children standing patiently on another doorstep somewhere else, knocking with that mechanical rhythm, waiting for the next person to make the mistake of looking into those impossible eyes and feeling their hand moving toward the lock despite everything inside them, screaming to leave the door closed, to back away, to survive the encounter by refusing the one thing these entities need from you: permission to come inside. Project Preserve, Destiny, Looking Glass Technology, and Seeing the Future. In the deepest levels of classified research, beyond what congressional oversight reaches, beyond what even most military personnel know exists, there allegedly sits a device that violates everything we understand about time, causality, and the fixed nature of reality. It's called Looking Glass, and according to whistleblowers who've risked everything to speak about it, this technology allows operators to view probable futures with enough clarity and detail that decisions affecting millions of lives are being made based on what the device shows. Not predictions, not forecasts derived from data analysis. Actual visual access to what will happen or what might happen, presented as scenes that can be observed, recorded, and studied. The implications are so profound that if the technology exists and works even partially as described, then everything you believe about free will, determinism, and humanity's trajectory through time needs revision. We might be living in a timeline that's already been viewed, decisions made by people who've seen the consequences before choosing, reality itself bent toward outcomes someone decided were preferable after watching the alternatives play out. The name Project Preserve Destiny suggests the purpose explicitly. Not just seeing the future, but preserving a specific version of it, guiding events toward desired outcomes while avoiding timelines that lead to catastrophe or scenarios the controllers find unacceptable. The project allegedly began decades ago, possibly as an extension of work that occurred during the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project, research into electromagnetic manipulation of time and consciousness that was never publicly acknowledged, but produced results significant enough to warrant continued development in deeper black programs. By the time Looking Glass became operational, the technology had supposedly advanced to the point where viewing future timelines was reliable enough to base policy decisions on what operators saw. The device itself is described through fragmented testimony from people who claim to have seen it or worked with it. A chair similar to descriptions from Montauk, where an operator sits surrounded by technology that interfaces with their consciousness. But instead of amplifying psychic abilities or projecting thoughts into reality, Looking Glass channels awareness forward through time, allowing the operator to perceive events that haven't happened yet. The viewing isn't passive like watching video. It's experiential, immersive, the operator existing in a future moment as if they're actually there, seeing through eyes that haven't opened yet, perceiving details with clarity that makes the experience indistinguishable from present reality. Dan Burish is the name most associated with Looking Glass testimony. He claims to have worked as a microbiologist on classified projects and gained access to information about the technology through his security clearance and project involvement. According to Burish, Looking Glass doesn't show a single fixed future, but rather displays probable timelines, branches that extend from present decision points. The operators can navigate between these probability streams, examining different versions of what might occur based on specific choices made in the present. It's not fortune-telling, it's systematic exploration of consequence space, mapping how present actions ripple forward through time and manifest in different outcomes depending on which path is chosen. The technology allegedly operates through manipulating what physicists would call the quantum foam, the seething probability field that underlies space-time at the smallest scales. By creating specific electromagnetic field configurations and interfacing human consciousness with these fields, Looking Glass somehow allows awareness to extend beyond the present moment and sample information from states that exist in probability but haven't yet collapsed into experienced reality. It sounds like science fiction, but quantum mechanics already acknowledges that particles exist in superposition of states until observed, and that information seems to flow backward through time in ways that violate our intuitive understanding of cause and effect. Looking Glass would be weaponized application of these principles, consciousness used as the observation mechanism to sample futures before they become present. What makes Burish's testimony particularly unsettling is his claim that operators saw something consistent across multiple probable timelines, a convergence point that appears in nearly every future they examined. He describes it vaguely, referring to a cataclysmic event, or transition, occurring in the first few decades of the 21st century, visible across different probability branches, with only the details varying. Some timelines showed environmental catastrophe. Others showed technological singularity where artificial intelligence transcends human control. Some displayed war or pandemic or societal collapse. The specifics differed, but the presence of major disruption remained constant, as if certain futures are more probable than others, certain outcomes carrying such weight in the probability field that avoiding them requires enormous effort or might be impossible. This convergence creates a horrifying scenario for anyone with access to Looking Glass. If you can see that catastrophe is probable or inevitable across most timelines, what do you do with that information? Do you tell the public, causing panic and potentially triggering the very collapse you're trying to avoid? Do you remain silent and attempt to guide events subtly, making policy decisions designed to steer toward the least damaging timeline without revealing why you're making those choices? Or do you conclude that the future is fixed, that Looking Glass shows what will happen regardless of intervention, and use the technology only to prepare for the inevitable while maintaining control over the transition? Project Preserve Destiny allegedly represents the third option evolved into active strategy. The idea isn't preventing the convergence, but controlling it, ensuring it unfolds in a manner that preserves certain power structures, certain groups, certain outcomes deemed essential by whoever makes these decisions. If collapse is coming, then prepare underground facilities for continuity of government. If environmental catastrophe is inevitable, ensure resources are positioned where they'll be accessible afterward. If technological singularity approaches, try to steer the artificial intelligence toward alignment with human controllers, rather than allowing it to develop independently. The future is being stage managed based on what Looking Glass shows, reality sculpted toward the least worst option from a menu of probable disasters. But there's a deeper problem, a paradox that sits at the heart of Looking Glass technology. If you view a future and then make decisions based on what you saw, you've changed the conditions that led to that future, potentially making it less likely to occur. This creates a feedback loop where the act of looking affects what's being seen, where futures are constantly shifting based on how observers respond to previous observations. The technology might be chasing its own tail, viewing timelines that change every time someone acts on the information. creating a hall of mirrors where no future is stable because the present keeps adjusting based on forward-looking intelligence. Some testimony suggests LookingGlass began showing increasingly chaotic or unstable results as it was used more extensively, as if excessive viewing was damaging the timeline structure itself, or as if some force was actively interfering with the technology. Operators reported seeing futures that made no sense, paradoxical outcomes, or scenarios where human civilization simply disappeared with no clear cause. Was this the device malfunctioning, reaching limits of what consciousness can perceive when pushed too far forward? Was it evidence that excessive timeline manipulation creates instability, that too much looking causes probability waves to collapse unpredictably? Or was something on the other end of the temporal connection looking back, aware it was being observed from the past, taking actions to conceal or distort what the operators could see? There are also claims that multiple nations developed LookingGlass technology independently, or through shared research, meaning different groups might be viewing futures and making decisions that conflict, each trying to steer toward their preferred timeline. If the United States sees and prepares for one future, while Russia or China sees and prepares for another, their competing preparations could create conditions that make both futures less likely while opening probability space for outcomes no one anticipated or wanted. The timeline becomes a battlefield where present actions are weapons aimed at killing undesirable futures while nurturing preferred ones. And human civilization is caught in the crossfire between competing visions of what should happen. The ethical implications are staggering. If a small group has access to future viewing technology, they possess power that makes traditional, political, military, or economic dominance look trivial by comparison. They know what will happen before it happens. They can position resources, make investments, start or prevent wars, all with knowledge of outcomes before anyone else even understands the full situation. This is beyond insider trading or tactical advantage. It's steering human destiny based on privileged information that no democratic process can access or contest. How do you vote against decisions made by people who've seen the consequences of not making them? How do you resist policy when its architects can claim, truthfully or not, that they viewed the alternatives, and this path leads to survival while others lead to extinction? There's also the question of self-fulfilling prophecy at civilization scale. If LookingGlass consistently shows certain futures and decisions are made to prepare for those futures, do the preparations themselves make the futures more likely? Building underground continuity facilities because you see collapse could redistribute resources in ways that make collapse more probable. Preparing for war because you see conflict could create tensions that manifest the war. Treating artificial intelligence as an existential threat because you saw it transcend control could lead to developmental approaches that ensure it views humanity as enemy when it finally emerges. The technology meant to help avoid catastrophe might be the mechanism ensuring it arrives. Burish also described seeing something in the far future that transcended the near-term convergence point, a version of humanity that had survived whatever transition occurs and evolved into something different, beings with capabilities that seem almost supernatural from our perspective, existing in harmony with technologies and consciousness patterns we can't currently comprehend. He referred to these as future humans, or possibly extraterrestrials, who are actually our descendants, having developed time travel and returning to various points in their past, our present, to observe or guide events. The implication is that the Greys, the beings associated with UFO encounters and abduction phenomena, might not be aliens from other planets, but humans from our own future, come back to ensure their timeline remains stable, perhaps even using looking glass technology themselves to identify critical junctures where intervention is necessary. This creates a mind-bending possibility. If future humans are using time travel to influence the past, and present humans are using looking glass to view and manipulate probable futures, then reality is caught in a loop where cause and effect blur completely. The future is shaping the present, which creates the future, which sends agents back to shape the past, which becomes the present. Free will in this model is complicated beyond comprehension. Are we making choices or executing a script written by our future selves who already know what we'll choose because they've already lived through it from the other end of time? The reason Project Preserve Destiny remains classified, if it exists, is obvious. Acknowledging looking glass technology would trigger immediate demand for access, for oversight, for public input into decisions being made based on future viewing. It would raise unanswerable questions about determinism and free will. It would create panic about whatever convergence point operators have identified, even if revealing that information might help avoid it. And most critically, it would expose that a very small group has been making choices that affect everyone based on information available only to them, effectively running shadow government that transcends normal political structures because it operates with knowledge pulled from tomorrow. The few who've spoken about looking glass have faced predictable responses: ridicule, dismissal, accusations of mental illness or fraud. Burish's testimony is questioned on every detail, his credentials disputed, his story picked apart by skeptics who note inconsistencies and lack of physical evidence. But the technology he describes is theoretically possible, according to some interpretations of quantum mechanics and general relativity. Closed time-like curves, retrocausality, quantum entanglement across time. These aren't science fiction concepts, but legitimate areas of theoretical physics. If the government invested in weaponizing these principles, the way they weaponized atomic physics, the result might look exactly like looking glass. And there are strange corroborations if you look for them. High-level strategic decisions that seem to make no sense based on publicly available information, but that in retrospect appear brilliant or prescient. Preparations for scenarios that seemed paranoid until they suddenly became relevant. Massive resource investments in projects whose purpose isn't clear until years later, when they turn out to be exactly what was needed. Are these just competent planning and lucky forecasting? Or are they decisions made by people who've already seen how things unfold, who know what's needed because they've watched versions of the future where those preparations saved civilizations, or where their absence led to collapse? The most disturbing aspect of Project Preserve Destiny isn't the technology itself, but what it suggests about reality. If the future can be viewed, then in some sense it already exists, laid out in probability space waiting to be experienced. But if viewing it changes it, then it exists in superposition, multiple versions simultaneously real until collapsed by observation and decision. We might be living in a curated timeline, a carefully selected branch chosen from thousands of alternatives because someone with access to looking glass decided this version was optimal or least catastrophic. Every major event, every seeming accident or coincidence could be the result of timeline management, reality steered towards specific outcomes by handlers who've seen what happens otherwise. And what about the convergence Burish described, the transition point visible across multiple futures? Are we approaching it now, living through the years when whatever looking glass operators saw decades ago is finally manifesting? Every crisis, every technological leap, every moment of instability could be part of the pattern they identified. Events unfolding according to what was viewed long before they occurred. If the operators saw this and made preparations, then whatever happens next has already been planned for, already been shaped by decisions made, based on knowledge of outcomes that haven't arrived yet, but have already been observed by consciousness stretched forward through probability space. Project Preserve. Destiny represents the ultimate conspiracy. Not hidden events in the past, but hidden knowledge of the future, used to shape the present in ways we can't see or understand. Somewhere in a facility we'll never visit, using technology that won't be acknowledged, operators might still be sitting in that chair, consciousness extending forward through time, watching what comes, reporting to authorities who make decisions based on those reports, steering all of us toward futures they've selected from the alternatives they've been shown. We're passengers in a vehicle whose destination was determined by people who've already visited it, living through a timeline that's already been viewed and approved, heading toward whatever convergence point appears across the probability branches, unable to know if we're moving toward salvation or catastrophe. Because the people with access to that information decided long ago that we're better off not knowing. That the future must be preserved exactly as they've seen it, regardless of whether any of us would choose differently if given the chance to look through the glass ourselves. Targeted individuals, people claiming constant surveillance and harassment. There's a growing community of people across the world who share a disturbing set of experiences they claim are ruining their lives. They report being under constant surveillance by unknown agencies or groups, experiencing electronic harassment through technologies they can't identify, hearing voices or sounds that no one else perceives, finding evidence that their homes have been entered and items moved or tampered with while they were away, and suffering coordinated harassment from strangers in public who seem to be following scripts designed to intimidate or destabilize them psychologically. They call themselves targeted individuals, or TIs, and they've found each other through online communities where thousands share remarkably similar stories, despite living in different countries, having different backgrounds, and claiming to have no connection to each other before becoming targeted. The phenomenon raises profoundly difficult questions about the nature of their experiences. Are these people victims of sophisticated, organized harassment campaigns, using advanced surveillance technology? Or are they experiencing shared delusions, patterns of mental illness that manifest in similar ways across different individuals because of common psychological mechanisms and the reinforcement effects of online communities where people validate each other's paranoid beliefs? The answer matters enormously, both for how we respond to their suffering and for what their experiences might reveal about surveillance capabilities, psychological warfare techniques, or the nature of certain mental health conditions in the digital age. The typical TI narrative follows certain patterns. The targeting often begins suddenly, sometimes after a specific incident that the person identifies as triggering: whistleblowing, political activism, a conflict with an employer or neighbor, or sometimes with no identifiable cause at all. They begin noticing things: strangers who appear repeatedly in different locations, vehicles that seem to follow them, people on the street who make gestures or comments that feel directed at them, technology behaving strangely in ways that suggest remote manipulation. The harassment escalates over time, becoming more overt and more distressing, expanding from street theater, the term TIs use for coordinated public harassment, into their homes through electronic means, through neighbors who participate in noise campaigns, or through wall harassment, through voice-to-skull technology that they claim can project sounds or voices directly into their heads. The consistency of reports across the TI community is striking. People who've never communicated before, discovering the community, describe identical types of harassment: organized stalking by groups of people, vehicles with specific colors following them, strangers coughing or making clicking sounds as they pass, directed energy weapons causing pain or illness, V2K, or voice-to-skull transmissions that sound like thoughts, but that the individual recognizes as external. the similarity could indicate that these are real tactics being deployed, that there's an actual playbook for psychological operations that multiple agencies or groups are using against targeted populations. Or the similarity could reflect the way certain mental illnesses manifest, patterns that repeat because human psychology and neurology produce consistent symptoms, with the internet allowing people experiencing these symptoms to find each other and collectively develop a shared framework that interprets their experiences through the targeting narrative rather than through mental health frameworks. The technology TIs describe being used against them includes real systems that exist in documented form alongside alleged capabilities that aren't publicly confirmed. Directed energy weapons, lasers, microwave emitters, acoustic devices are real technologies with military and law enforcement applications. Active denial systems that use millimeter waves to create intense heat sensation have been developed for crowd control. Long-range AIG, acoustic devices can project painful sound at specific targets. These technologies demonstrate that remote influence and harassment is technically possible, though the miniaturized, portable versions that TIs claim are being used against them in residential settings aren't commercially available or easily accessible. Voice-to-skull technology is more controversial. The Frey effect, where microwave pulses can create audible perception directly in the human head, is real and documented science. Patents exist for technologies that could theoretically project sound to specific individuals. But whether functional, targetable, long-range V2K systems exist that could be deployed against civilians without massive, obvious equipment is disputed. TIs claim to experience voices, sounds, or synthetic thoughts that feel externally generated. But these symptoms also match descriptions of auditory hallucinations associated with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, creating an evidentiary problem where the claimed harassment and the symptoms of certain mental illnesses produce indistinguishable, subjective experiences. The surveillance that TIs report ranges from plausible to implausible. Being followed, having one's communications monitored, having GPS tracked. These are all technically feasible and have been documented in stalking cases, corporate espionage, and government surveillance programs. But TIs also claim capabilities that strain credibility. Real-time tracking regardless of precautions, reading thoughts or subvocalizations, seeing through walls to monitor activity inside homes, manipulating dreams or memories. Either surveillance technology is far more advanced than publicly acknowledged, or the perception of surveillance exceeds its actual scope, with the psychological state of believing you're being watched creating hypervigilance that interprets normal events as evidence of monitoring. The organized stalking or gang stalking component describes coordinated harassment by multiple people, acting in concert to destabilize the target. In documented cases, organized stalking has occurred. Domestic abuse situations where an abuser mobilizes friends and family to harass a victim. Corporate campaigns against whistleblowers, or harassment by extremist groups. These real instances demonstrate that coordinated group harassment happens. But TIs typically describe operations involving dozens or hundreds of participants, strangers who've been recruited or hired to follow them, neighbors who've been induced to participate in harassment campaigns, and infrastructure that seems implausibly large and well-coordinated to sustain against individuals who often aren't prominent or threatening, in ways that would justify such resource expenditure. The psychological perspective identifies targeted individual experiences as consistent with persecutory delusions, a category of symptoms appearing in schizophrenia, delusional disorder, and other conditions. These disorders can produce absolute conviction that one is being surveilled and harassed despite lack of objective evidence, can create interpretation patterns where ambiguous events are coded as intentional harassment and can generate auditory hallucinations that the person experiences as external communication rather than internal generation. The internet and TI communities then provide validation and elaborate framework that reinforces these beliefs, makes the person less likely to seek psychiatric help, and deepens the conviction that their experiences are real and externally generated, rather than symptoms requiring treatment. But dismissing all TI reports as mental illness is problematic for several reasons. First, it's patronizing and potentially gaslighting. If someone is experiencing genuine harassment and reporting, it produces psychiatric diagnosis. Rather than investigation, the system becomes another tool of their victimization. Second, we know from declassified programs like COINTELPRO, MKUltra, and various surveillance abuses that governments have conducted operations against civilians that included psychological warfare, harassment, and experimentation. Dismissing all claims as delusion could mean missing real victims of continuing programs. Third, the diagnosis of delusion itself can be circular. The person claims they're being harassed. Investigators find no evidence, therefore they must be delusional. But lack of found evidence doesn't prove absence of harassment, given how sophisticated surveillance and psychological operations could be. The challenge of helping TIs is significant, regardless of whether their experiences stem from external harassment or internal psychological conditions. If they're genuinely being targeted, they need protection and investigation. If they're experiencing mental health crises, they need treatment. But TIs typically resist psychiatric framing of their experiences, having often tried to report their harassment to police or other authorities and been dismissed or referred for mental health evaluation, which they interpret as the system colluding with their harassers. The online TI community actively discourages members from accepting mental health diagnoses or treatment, framing psychiatry as part of the targeting apparatus, which prevents those who might benefit from treatment from receiving it. The suffering is real, regardless of cause. TIs describe lives destroyed by their experiences, lost jobs because they couldn't function, or because they accused coworkers of being harassers, destroyed relationships because family and friends don't believe them, or are themselves accused of participating in the targeting. Constant fear and hypervigilance that prevents rest or normalcy. In some cases, suicide because the harassment becomes unbearable. Whether the harassment is external or the suffering stems from untreated mental illness, producing these terrible experiences, the pain is genuine and the impact on quality of life is devastating. There are also documented edge cases that complicate clean categorization. Instances where surveillance that seemed paranoid was later proven real. Corporate espionage victims who were dismissed as paranoid before evidence emerged of actual monitoring. Abuse victims whose claims of organized harassment by their ex-partner's network were validated by evidence. These cases demonstrate that what appears to be paranoid delusion can sometimes be accurate assessment of actual threat, creating an ethical imperative not to reflexively dismiss all claims as illness. The question of motive, why would anyone target ordinary individuals with such elaborate harassment, is where many skeptical assessments focus. TIs often can't identify why they're valuable targets, why resources would be expended to harass them. Some propose they're being used as test subjects for perfecting psychological warfare techniques, that they're random selections meant to develop and refine methods that will later be used more broadly. Others suggest blacklists or algorithmic selection, where people get flagged for characteristics that trigger targeting, even if they don't understand what made them targets. Without clear motive, the harassment seems purposeless, which supports the mental health interpretation. But intelligence and military operations don't always have obvious motives from outside perspectives, and test programs by their nature wouldn't target people for strategic reasons, but for experimental reasons. The ethical approach involves taking claims seriously enough to investigate when possible, providing resources for protection if evidence of actual harassment exists, while also ensuring access to mental health support without forcing it on people against their will, or using psychiatric diagnosis as a weapon to discredit legitimate complaints. This balance is difficult to achieve in practice. Law enforcement typically finds no evidence to support TI claims and doesn't have resources to provide indefinite protection based on unprovable allegations. Mental health services can't force treatment on people who refuse it unless they meet criteria for involuntary commitment. Support organizations often aren't equipped to handle the complexity of cases where harassment might be real, might be delusional, or might be some combination that doesn't fit clean categories. The TI phenomenon also serves as a lens for examining surveillance society and the psychological effects of living under actual widespread monitoring. We know our digital communications are surveilled by corporations and governments, that algorithms track and predict our behavior, that cameras and sensors record our movements through public spaces. This real surveillance could create conditions where people who are more sensitive to these intrusions or who have psychological vulnerabilities interpret the ambient surveillance as targeted personal harassment, mistaking the general panopticon for specific persecution. Or the real surveillance infrastructure might occasionally be weaponized against individuals in ways that produce TI experiences, with most dismissals of their claims serving to hide the minority of cases where targeting is actually occurring. What remains clear is that thousands of people globally identify as targeted individuals, share remarkably consistent descriptions of harassment and surveillance, suffer real distress from their experiences, and struggle to find help or validation in systems that either dismiss them as delusional or lack resources to investigate their claims. Whether they're victims of sophisticated psychological operations that most people never become aware of, whether they're experiencing symptoms of mental illness that present in culturally specific ways shaped by surveillance society and shared online narratives, or whether the truth involves some complex interaction between real harassment and psychological vulnerability. Where both exist but are difficult to disentangle, the phenomenon represents significant suffering and raises important questions about surveillance, mental health, and how we respond when people report experiences that seem implausible, but that can't be definitively disproven, and that cause obvious harm to those experiencing them. The targeted individual community continues to grow online, continues to share stories and strategies, continues to document their harassment, and support each other through experiences that isolate them from friends and family who don't believe them. They deserve compassion regardless of whether their experiences stem from external harassment or internal illness, and they deserve serious engagement with their claims rather than reflexive dismissal, even when those claims seem to exceed credible possibility. Because the cost of being wrong, of dismissing genuine victims as delusional, or of enabling mental illness by validating delusions, is high in both directions, leaving us with a phenomenon that resists easy resolution, that challenges our frameworks for understanding both surveillance capabilities and mental health, and that will likely persist as technology advances and as online communities continue to provide spaces where people experiencing these symptoms can find others who share their reality, validating experiences that the broader society refuses to acknowledge or believe.